Thank you very much. Our third block here is going to take up a theme that virtually all of the other speakers have talked about, which is how do we connect what we're doing in innovation studies to policy. And a sub-theme of that is going to be indicators. It's going to get some loving attention here, given the speakers that we have for the session. And I'm going to move right on introducing them with a continuing promise to those of you who would like to spend a few minutes after this session ends, if you really do want to hear my dancing stories from the Volga River at the Saratov meeting. I was asked in our organization to actually try to summarize a bit of what's been said in the earlier sessions. It looks like we've got a lot of continuity of participation, which has been great. And so I don't feel as though I need to do too much of that, but just by way of sort of framing the challenge for our two speakers, we have really touched remarkably on the distinctive contributions of the Globelics network, with the core being thinking about systems, linking different kinds of knowledge, linking local, national, and global dynamics, and putting that all into a political and social context. That's the intellectual core of what we brought into the network, but then the network has very distinctively added looking at all those issues from the viewpoint of the Global South. And we have done that by working together, by sharing, by being participatory and inclusive in ways that none of the networks that are just anchored in the Global North have done. And so that, and then two themes have been brought in as the network developed that are extremely important in that global interactive system context. The how do we achieve sustainability at all those different levels, and how do we address global inequality, which has also emerged in the external environment as a theme in ways that it wasn't 20 years ago, but we have had a distinctive contribution out of this STI, learning, innovation, and competence building system. So all of those things are so important, and we've been able to feel throughout this workshop the urgency of those issues that are only more urgent now than they were earlier. How do we link that into practice? I've been really impressed by the different kinds of practice that speakers have brought in that we need to link to it, that can be happening at civil society. It can be happening at local innovation levels. I loved the story of Brazil's local systems addressing COVID better than the national and international ones did. The ingenuity and resiliency and innovativeness that comes from different parts of the system is really exciting. When we talk about policy and indicators, which our two speakers are going to address, we tend to think of that at national level, but it's certainly our challenge, and we may very well focus on that in the next 40 or 45 minutes. But as our series develops month by month, all the way through April next year, and then into the Globelics conference next fall, I think we will keep in front of us the variety of those challenges to action. How do we actually have our impact, given how important the issues are that we're addressing and how much we've already contributed at a thinking level to addressing those? Who are our audiences? Who are our partners in putting all that into action? So with that as a little bit of background, I am delighted to say a few words of introduction to both of our contributors this morning. Glenda Kruss is executive head of the Center for Science, Technology, and Innovation Indicators in the Human Science Research Council in South Africa. And I can say that in my experience, this is the lead institution working on innovative approaches to innovation in development in those very difficult senses that we're trying to get defined, as Diana has pointed out. Go check her out on LinkedIn. The publications have been impressive. She's dealt with a lot of different issues and is now leading a great team that represents the kind of things that we want to be doing in Globelics. Commenting on Glenda's introductory presentation will be Marcelo Matos, who is a researcher in the University Federal de Rio de Janeiro, and has actually been there since his PhD work. This, again, as a unit, is one of the ones that has been most directly linked into the difficult policymaking environment in Brazil. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Marcelo's reaction on these challenges that we have, because he's not only been a participant in developing some of the major research themes, he has also watched kind of the hand-to-hand engagement that can go on in policy spheres. So welcome both Glenda and Marcelo. And Glenda, over to you for your comments at this point.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody. So I'd also just want to start off with my brief reflection on Globelics and how I came to be here. And I want to bring our late colleague, Lorenz, into the Zoom, because he was the person who literally ordered me to join the Globelics conference and then changed my academic trajectory completely. And I have to say that in everything I do, I'm thinking, what would Yo say, and would he be happy with this? So I think we have to have tribute to him today. And then the second thing I want to say for people who don't know me is that I very much work at the research policy nexus. So I create national STI data sets, R&D and innovation surveys, and I work very closely with government and policymakers. And what we're seeing increasingly in that space, in the same way that we are having to deal with changes, is that there's much more of an appetite and appreciation and an opportunity for better evidence for policy and for more useful evidence for policy. And that is driving the work that we've been doing. And what
we'd love it if you go into slideshow mode.
I'm on my way. I'm on my way.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
And what I'm going to do today is just kind of, I've got one diagram with a kind of high level agenda just to touch. I'm not going to talk to everything, but I'm going to touch on this wide agenda. And then I want to demonstrate a few new methodological approaches and a few new matrices, and then talk about a few possible policy approaches. And again, it's very much based in a South African as a middle income country under huge stress, and our work in Africa with other low income countries. So our challenge here is to, I just want to make this smaller so that I don't interfere, is to design and to find evidence for contextually grounded appropriate indicators. And it's very hard to talk about indicators when you didn't know all the kinds of issues, the development, identity, definitions of development, etc., and the development challenges. But at its most broadest level, I think what Globelics is trying to do and needs to be doing is in harnessing science, technology, and innovation towards structural, social, and economic transformation. And what we are trying to do then through that transformation is moving towards sustainable and inclusive development trajectories. And as Bent Orkel Lundvall's been stressing, these are highly contextualized to our different settings. And so the contextualization is really, really important. Now, what you see in the gray, so the two blocks on the left after the gray and green blocks are just some of the kinds of actors and spaces in which we would be trying to develop matrices and indicators. But the gray blocks are where we find most of the indicator work thus far globally, which tends to focus on firms, which tends to use a very limited set of methodologies like bibliometrics, patents, maybe surveys of university industry linkages or technology transfer, and very strongly drawing on econometrics. But there are also R&D surveys and innovation surveys, and these are typically used for global benchmarking. But what is needed in the Globelics community is to use our tools around learning and capabilities and competence building to stretch and think about new dimensions that we need to be measuring and new methodologies that we're using to measure, and then the new metrics we can design. So I'm just going to focus a little bit with some examples around measuring innovation and learning at local level in informal enterprises in resource-poor settings. So when we come there, and this is just one example, but I think in Globelics, we are doing this, where I say new dimensions, it's new dimensions in the sense that we don't typically have measures and indicators for these, but these are vital measures for us to begin to engage with policymakers to bring up to assist with alternatives towards the kinds of development changes we might, inclusive and sustainable development changes we might want to see. So, for example, we've heard a lot of talk today about the importance of institutional dynamics, of understanding innovation capabilities, of understanding networks and knowledge flows, and we put interaction at the core of what we do. But do we understand the capabilities that are needed to interact, whether it's between universities and firms or government and community, or firms and firms? So those are some of the dimensions that we need to be able to have measures for, and we certainly don't get them, and they can't be, bibliometrics and patents can't be used as proxies. So drawing on the conceptual basis and foundation that we have gained in Globelics, we can take some of those core surveys. We obviously will have to design new surveys, but we can adapt, for example, Oslo-based innovation surveys to begin to understand the rate and nature of innovation in specific settings. And what we've been experimenting with is how you do that in local innovation and production systems. And then there is a move in a few places across the world to actually design instruments to measure DUI modes. And I think that's something we need to be building on. I think that we have to because of our attempts to link local, national, global, we have to do multiple detailed comparative case studies, and we need multiple comparative case studies so that we can begin to build theory, as Gabriella's asked us to do. But when we're working with communities or with civil society or with informal enterprises, we have to work in a very different way. And there we need participatory methods. We need to use more ethnographies, and Eric has raised the issue. We need to think about how we can use engaged policy experiments where we involve people on the ground, firms, government, and academics in trying to design alternative ways of doing things in an action research reflective process. So those are some of the methodologies that we could be using. And I wanted to just go back for 1 second to talk about measuring DUI modes. So here's an example where we surveyed local informal enterprises in a specific local territory, and we have different, we designed a local innovation category system for the sectors because they don't fit with standard industrial codes. And then in the Oslo instrument, we had questions that were added or adapted or with new items that assessed whether there was innovation through doing, using, and acting, but we also found it was important to assess imitating and searching, and then, of course, where STI was being used. So this is a new kind of information that we can create that helps us to address the issues that we are concerned with. And here's a second example where we use case studies to map out local innovation and production systems. In this case, it was an informal food consumption and distribution services in a resource-poor setting. And we've mapped out all the formal and informal actors. And then in the instrument, we've measured the frequency of interaction with each of these sources, which then allows us to map interaction and knowledge pathways and the strengths of interaction and identify spaces for interventions and strategies to strengthen networks and to link these networks into formal value chains and other local networks. And then if we come back to the issue of new matrices, we obviously need very different indicator frameworks because the indicator frameworks that most of our countries use are based on OECD and European indicator frameworks that come out of high-income countries. And so there's a big trend and something we can pursue in Globelics, and Joe talked about it, about mapping science and technology and R&D alignment to the SDGs or to national development priorities. And I think that's something that also adds value in terms of shaping the direction of the knowledge system as a whole at the national level. And then I think we need a lot more research that helps us to identify topologies of sectoral systems, spatial systems, socio-technical systems, networks, because we need topologies of those to be able to design some matrices. And linked to that, there's a lot of scope for doing more work on identifying and designing modes of innovation that actually exist in our context. So if you go back to look at that gray box that says islands of excellence with majority of, so in South Africa, we're assuming that we are innovating on a wide scale, but when you look at what's actually there, we have some islands of excellence, and most firms are adopting technologies from elsewhere, perhaps modifying them, or they're not innovating at all. So it's important to understand those modes and the profile of who's in each of those kinds of modes, again, in order to be able to design strategies for intervention. And then sorry, I'm jumping around. So the way we've used some of these modes of innovation and profiles in relation to the informal sector. So we found we had a topology that there are 4 modes of innovation in these informal enterprises. They could be imitative, inward focusing and survivalist enterprises, or they could be complex, but they work in a collaborative way, and they're better knowledge flows, and they're opportunity driven, and they are able to go on to stronger development trajectories. So along the left are a set of items and measures that we use to categorize the innovation modes in each of those 4 groups. And then we see that 2 groups actually require foundational innovation capability building because they don't have some very, very basic knowledge and learning capabilities. And 2 of the other groups can have a different kind of capability building that's related to building their innovation capabilities. So this is a very complex explanation, and I don't want to get sidetracked on that, but the important is about creating topologies and then using that to identify modes of interaction and profile them, and then be able to identify where you need policy intervention. And a second example that can be very useful is for us.
Sorry to interrupt, you got about 2 minutes left.
Okay, well, the second example is about maturity indices, and policymakers love these. So you choose your key dimensions and then you rate each organization. You can do a very simple rating on whether they're excellent, good, work in progress, or challenges, or any sets of dimensions. But this gives you a very important kind of tool to be able to track progress over time and to identify gaps and to inform capability building and competence building. So to end off, then, what does this tell us about engaging with innovation policymakers in a different way? And I think it's important, and one way Globelics can be intervening is that we can use our evidence on innovation in local learning economies to shift STI policy narratives. Because I'm pretty sure in South America and in parts of Asia, and I know through Africa, policy officials are caught up in narratives of national growth models and growing good over GDP, and they do not have workable contextualized development models. So there's space to use these alternate kinds of indicators and indices to shift those STI policy narratives. And then again, I've shown you in a few ways these new kinds of indices can be used to inform alternate approaches, because we find policymakers know that they want a different kind of policy for inclusive and sustainable development, but they don't know how to review what they have or design new policies, or once they have new policies to monitor and evaluate. So I think there's scope for us to use our research in that space. And then there's a gap to design alternative measures and indicators of outcomes and impacts, which is a great concern of the policymaker. And finally, we've got I've listed a number of new methods. I won't go into that, but just to pick up on the point Erica made, engaging as researchers and engaged work it becomes very important in this kind of space. And if you want to follow up on any of the research, there are some of the links. And I will stop sharing and hand over to Susan.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you, Glenda, for doing all that work and for sharing it with us, and showing the ways that it's embedded, or at least pointing to the fact that it's embedded in international networks that are moving in some of these directions. Marcelo, we're now going to turn to you for comments and observations from your experience.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nice. First of all, I would like to thank a lot to have the opportunity to be here with you. And I have learned a lot with my experience within the Globelics community. Since the first conference here in Rio, I had the opportunity to attend as an undergraduate student still. Well, I appreciated a lot the presentation of Professor Glenda. In fact, she is a big reference for us and for me. Especially every time I hear her, I learn a lot about the perspectives and how to think about moving ahead on this issue of indicators and policy. First of all, I think it's important to highlight this issue Professor Glenda said about the need to shift the STI policy narratives, or in a broader sense, because in Brazil, when we take up this research agenda on local innovation production systems, we are more and more trying to move ahead, not in the direction of a STI policy agenda, but on a local development policy agenda. And in this way, what we see in experience here, for example, this framework we try to develop on local innovation systems and production system in Brazil was taken up by policy initiatives for a long period of time during more left-wing organizations, and we have a big hope that more positive days will come back soon. But what we saw is that indicators shape policy. I think that's one of the most important things we have to, and this main slide of Professor Glenda, I hope you're not angry because I made a print screen of it. And I worked down on the many issues that are there, which are very, very important to highlight.
Okay, Glenda, can you see the chat? Maybe you could take a question while we're waiting for Marcelo to appear. Elias has asked, the idea about measuring DUI innovation mode is very interesting for developing countries where low technology sectors are very important for their economies. For example, textile and agri-food industries. Do you want to comment on some of how the challenges that your team has faced in doing that and how you've solved them?
Well, the issue is that actually we need to measure STI and DUI modes in formal enterprises as well. Because we're assuming that we're having high-tech economies, but some research that our people have done show, I think, that we've got what could be classified as one high textile sector in South Africa. So the DUI does become much more important in the low technology sectors. So it's not only in the informal enterprises, but we had more space to experiment in those instruments so we could try out adapting questions. And now that we've tried those questions in the informal sector, we can think about adapting them back into our main BIS, our main business innovation survey.
Great. Marcelo, welcome back. We were just punting by answering one of the questions that appeared already in the chat. Now, you probably don't know when you disappeared, so you are just going to need to rewind the audio a little bit and start a bit before you realize that you lost us. But we're glad you were able to get back.
I'm sorry for, I don't know what happened. The internet.
Not your fault.
So no, I was just stressing this fact that in experience we saw that the indicators we have to a big extent shape policy action. Because when you come to policymakers, they want to have success, they want to show positive results according to what is considered to be the positive aspects and what are considered to be the desirable outcomes of that policy. And so I think one of our main challenges is to move in this direction. Professor Glenda showed us very inspiring perspectives of incorporating other dimensions. And especially one thing we have been very make big efforts here in Brazil is to think about how to identify this dimension, for example, of dynamic interactive capabilities, networks and flows. And so move ahead on indicators which are able to identify how far local interaction occurs on different levels, on how different learning modes are mobilized, and especially moving more ahead than science STI and DUI modes to consider how, what sense the social technical dynamics which happen on the territory, incorporate traditional knowledge, local knowledge, contextualized knowledge to a big extent for directing STI efforts and policies in the direction which are compatible and conducive for local development. So this has a lot to do, for example, with the research agenda. Andrew proposed a lot of thinking about emergent processes from the territory. We have to move ahead in this direction. And Professor Glenda showed us a lot of inspiring dynamic dimensions we have to think about. On our experience and efforts, I would add, for example, the need to go in more detail about what some literature calls social capital, social capabilities, about the effective capacity of local actors to take stake, to participate, and to coordinate policy initiatives. Some interesting methodologies are being and theoretical frameworks are experimental. For example, we had an interesting project led by some scholars from Mexico about policy dialogue, creating metrics for identifying the different communities which exist, how they are, what kind of stake they really have to participate to shape policy, not only in its creation, but also during its implementation and evaluation. And especially for the evaluation sphere, is that where we need a lot of these new metrics in order to be able to show what is really relevant for having success in this sense. And for instance, in this perspective, another issue which is very important is to think about the convergence of different policies. This is to say, to take, for example, this schemes about innovation system, this picture where you have in the center of it production innovation subsystem, you have the science technology research subsystems and other subsystems, to try to put in the middle of this scheme society and ask about what kind of processes of science, technology, innovation interact, and what kind of policies interact with policies for industry, for city, for infrastructure, for social development, for culture, for education and health, for delivering social desirable outcomes. This is to say, to switch around the perspectives, asking science and technology and innovation for what? For what objective? So as we have in a long tradition in the studies of science, technology, and society, that all the science, technology processes, innovation processes are not neutral, they are political oriented. And so it's important for us to be able to identify how far our research agenda is inside a framework which you could call a neoliberal capitalist social technical trajectory, and in how far other trajectories exist on the ground floor of the territory. For example, when you think about solidarity trajectory, it's not an alternative way to capitalism, but to try to bring it into your framing bias, to see what happens. And then you find out there's a lot happening on the local sphere. And when we talk about local innovation production system and about emergent processes, you see alternative currencies, solidarity schemes, ways of articulating networks of producers, which are not based only on competition, but on solidarity initiatives. And these things exist, and they have to be brought into this framework for us to be able to have a better framing and building the indicators. This is the most important challenge for us. be able to bring the indicators to the table to inform policy action in this way. So these are just some thoughts about the contributions of Professor Glenda, which are fantastic and very inspiring of what we are also trying to do in our research efforts here.
Thank you, Marcelo, and thank you for persisting and mastering technology. I want to remind everybody that you can put questions in the chat. We have about 14-15 minutes left before we need to hand back over to Erica to close out the entire workshop, but we certainly have time for questions. The first one actually comes from Flavio. Flavio, are you out there? Flavio Peixoto. And do you want to ask this yourself? Glenda can see it in the chat. There's Flavio.
Yeah. Hello, how are you? Hi,
We're
Glenda.
good.
How are you? It's good to see you again, Glenda, and all of you. And I was commenting on the chat that from a national statistical office, it is quite difficult to adapt the indicators to make the surveys and indicators more compatible, so to speak, with the national realities and the national needs. Because as Glenda mentioned, we have to follow some rules from a statistical office point of view to follow the specific indicators design. So I'd like you, Glenda, if you could comment on how much flexibility you have there to adapt to new indicators or to make them more closely to the policy needs designs, and how much can you actually influence on the policy design perspective. Thank you very much, and it was a very nice presentation, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Glenda, please go ahead.
Well, a couple of things. So firstly, I am proposing that for the Globelics community, it's an area to work in the upcoming period to think more about how we can design measures to be able to measure the kinds of dynamics that we think are important about learning and knowledge and capability building. Because it needs a huge amount of research to be able to design new measures. So that's the first one. I think it's an important item and a potential contribution of a Globelics. The second point is that it depends on the policy context in your country. So under a Bolsonaro government, I don't think you would have any room. Under our current government, we have a new white paper on science, technology, and innovation policy, and at its core is a commitment to transformation and inclusive and sustainable development. But then what happens in practice is that the known methods and indicators and measures are used, and they can't really give you any much valuable information for different kinds of policy design. So, but then you're in a very difficult space of politics with a small p, because how do you as the researcher have influence? And that's where it gets to the need for these kinds of engaged research processes. So it's not a straightforward, simple, easy matter. But my attitude is also that we have to be very pragmatic, and we have to experiment and try it. And we have to have something to show. So for example, at one point we designed an indicator of an alternative to GERD over GDP that uses the Human Development Index. And it wasn't a brilliant indicator technically, but we designed it as a kind of advocacy tool to engage with policymakers to say, in a country like ours, with our national development plan and our stated commitments, That's not to say that they enacted policy commitments. Don't you think we should be measuring how our STI is oriented to human development and not only to growing GERD over GDP? So it's that kind of possible intervention to try to shift narratives.
May I add something to that?
Yeah, absolutely, Marcelo. And then we'll get to Reiner.
Hello, friend Flavio. Miss you. Just
Brazilians meeting each other in the global space. We love it.
No, because of course the official statistics office has some much more greater challenge to work and to move ahead with statistics and so on. But I think to many perspectives, the policy experiences we have can highlight spaces for bringing into those indicators. For example, in Brazil, we had an observatory of local innovation production systems, which was supported by many ministries. And at that space, it was possible to gather information at local scale by those who are implementing policies about many of these processes. And this is a rich arena for moving ahead and learning how far these indicators work and enhancing them over time. So I think it's coming to the statistical office is a future process after we will learn on those other spheres which exist and are capable of incorporating them.
Let me also note that, of course, there's different structural locations for the places where these indicators are developed. And Glenda has the blessing of being in an actual research council, which understands research and has given her permission in her work plan to actually do some of the research that goes into the methods that we talked about. And not all of the places that do like innovation surveys have that that location, but it's something for all of us to keep in mind. But I just want to strengthen her call for, we're a research community, first and foremost, in Globelics. And if we're not doing the case studies and the kind of underlying work that the indicators people can draw on, then there's very little chance that we'll have new indicators either. Reiner, do you want to come in with your question now?
Yes. First of all, I want to support Glenda's remark and would add that even in the North, we have the same kind of problems and the same kind of need to develop new forms of metrics and indicators. We have a lot of talk that research and should support transformation, should support sustainability, should support social innovations. But in the end, policymakers look at the existing frameworks and tend to forget these nice lip service. So perfectly the same challenge. It's really a global challenge. I have also a specific question to you in the talks I have with people looking into assessing sustainability R&D policies. One issue also came up. We have a much stronger directionality, and policymakers not only ask, is that research somehow related to the SDGs, but they also ask what is actually the impact on the SDGs. And that becomes very difficult. We have attribution problems, we have timing, ex-ante problems. My question to you, do you also see that Globelics should look into that kind of issue? And perhaps does that also involve, like in the session with Rasmus, that we have perhaps to open up also to other communities who, for example, do strategic sustainability impact assessment and so forth?
Oh, this sounds like really great previews for policy and indicator section of future workshops in addition to this one. Marcelo, do you have any comments you want to make on that first, and then we'll turn to Glenda?
Yeah, please, Glenda first.
Okay.
Don't really have to say too much more except to say I totally agree. And I think also one of the big challenges right now that I didn't draw on is if you're going to be looking at indicators in relation to the SDGs, take, for example, eradicating hunger and ensuring food security, you've got to look at so many domains and you've got to bring together so much expertise. So I've been playing with that a little bit to see what data you have, who would need to be involved in designing it, what kinds of research you need, and so on. Because it's very cross-field, let alone multidisciplinary. And then when you talk to the environmental, you can see that I've done more work on the inclusion side than on the sustainability. So to do the sustainability, we would have to partner, definitely.
Okay, more teeing things up for future work, and we've just been joined by Ismail Raffles, who was involved in that strings project that Joe was talking about earlier, that has tried to do this matching between the SDGs and what's going on in STI efforts that are measurable with standard indicators, although incredibly sophisticated analysis. But once you find the gaps, which they've done an excellent job of doing, then the question of, all right, how do you actually make those connections becomes really strong. So I'm going to turn to Andrew Cummings. He's put a couple questions in the chat, and those will be our last ones probably before we close out the session. Andrew, come on in.
I wanted to take advantage of the two people who've been talking and have a dynamic relationship. How have you actually worked together between Brazil and South Africa I've seen LIPS coming up in South Africa. I've seen it presented in South Africa. I'm hearing Marcelo talking about engagement with your team. Can you just tell us about how that's happening? Because we're talking about how, and that's one moment on your little case study. How have y'all been collaborating? What's been the key?
Oh, reflexiveness. We are going to be our own case study. Who would like to start, Marcelo?
We had a couple of collective research projects years ago, looking on local innovation production systems in the field of health, of social inclusion. And it was in the scope of a specific project of ours. We managed to have a closer interaction. But in the last couple of years, not. So I have just accessing Professor Glenda's work because it's very relevant in that discussion.
But it's also through Globelics. I mean, you have to give credit. Yes. We met through Globelics and we saw that there was common issues and we started to work together. And then we've done exchanges. That's also very important. We've been to each other's research units. We've done webinars. We've spoken on one-to-one level. We've read each other's work and commented on it. So I think that's all important. Is that what you're getting at? And I think that's...
Let's bring Flavio in as a third leg on this. Just a second, Andrew, because Flavio then has a different connection to Glenda's unit.
Mm. Well, it's the same because, well, I met Flavio when I went to Redicis and he came to one of my seminars. And then we started to talk afterwards because we both do innovation surveys. And then I said, well, we need to work together and share experiences. And we started off in that way.
Network. Andrew, did you have something else you wanted to bring in?
Just that this is the level of strategizing that we need, right? We have done this. We've done this on multiple fronts as Globelics. We don't really recognize the details of how we're doing it. And now we need to take a second order learning and reflect on this and see how we can take this forward, both within us and between us, right? I can see experiment happening on the ground in South Africa between Globelics and Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium and creating a nexus there around a chair. you know, and that's really interesting as well for Globelics, I believe.
Okay, that's a very nice lead in then into tying up the session. I mean, our apologies that this may have run longer than you thought, but we all got pushed back about a half an hour by the first session, which was so rich that we didn't mind spending 2 hours on it at all. So Marina is actually, I'm going to turn it back over to her to actually tie up the entire workshop. And then I hope that Rasmus can actually leave us online for a few minutes to do a little more of the informal chat, which has been fun. Marina, please.
Thank you, Susan. I think now that we are almost finishing our workshop, first of all, I would like to remind you that this is the first workshop of a series of 5 workshops, and I would like to invite you for the next one that will be in the 26th of November. Globalization and structural transformation. You will receive an email inviting you soon. And the other 3 workshops will be next year. The first one in 1st of February, technological change in emerging technologies. The 4th workshop will be on the 4th of March. Environmentally sustainable development, and the last one will be in April the 1st, innovation and inclusive development. I would like to thank everyone who has been here with us in the last 4 hours. It has been hard work, especially for a Saturday morning, afternoon, or night. But I also think that the contributions and debate have shown that we really needed to have such an opportunity. The results of this meeting shows the potential of this effort to build the new research agenda for Globelics, and I'm sure we'll have very important and interesting results of this series of workshop that we'll be able to discuss, to present, and to increase in the next Globelics conference in India next year. I think that's it. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, my colleagues from the organizing team. And I wish you a very good weekend. And also I wish you, I would like to ask you to cross your fingers for our election tomorrow, okay?
And thank you to Marina for bravely taking on this very first one. Thank you, Marina.